Trust me, you've never heard a story like this. A Mind Beyond Words is a story about a connection between a teacher and a child who's autistic. They develop a connection, a telepathic connection, and the story unfolds from there.
One time I was talking to him about one of these very complicated esoteric books I'd been reading, because I was reading like crazy to try and keep up with him. He kept on telling me all these amazing downloads he was getting from some multidimensional source, and I was reading everything I could to try and keep abreast of what he was talking about. And he was in his early teens then, I suppose, and I'd found this one book that I just could not understand. It was absolutely beyond my comprehension. I was trying to explain what I'd read in this book to him, and I was rubbish. I could not do it. He looked at me and said, "Have you got it with you?" And I said, "Yeah." "Hold it out flat on the palm of your hand." So I got it out of my bag. I held this book out. I can't remember the title of the book, but it was quite complicated stuff. And held it out on the palm of my hand. And he just took his own hand and laid it very gently on top of the book for a couple of minutes, probably less than that, and smiled, and then took his hand away. And then he just very calmly gave me a very detailed précis of the bit that I'd already read and the bit that I hadn't even got to, and just summed up the book in, I don't know, within 5 minutes.
I'm talking with Jes Kerzen, the book A Mind Beyond Words. This is an incredible piece of work talking about autism and telepathy. What we'll do is just give Jes a chance to explain her story, how it works, the child that she met when he was, I believe, 6, and the whole story, how it unfolds, because this is fascinating. It opens a whole new world. Jes, thank you. Thank you for writing the book. This is fantastic.
Oh, well, I'm very glad that you find it so. That's lovely to know. Yeah, it seemed a really important story to tell. It just became so huge that I thought I can't not share this.
I saw one of the posts you had on Medium. You also write there, and you said the hard thing is to describe telepathy. So maybe let's start with that. Yeah.
Oh, hard question to start. Yeah, especially the sort of telepathy that I'm using with the young man that A Mind Beyond Words describes. Telepathy is a non-worded conversation. It's being able to communicate with another person, but obviously not using word of mouth, and in some senses not using words at all, because it's mind to mind, and it bypasses all the linguistic stuff. Does that make sense?
Yes, and the thing about this is, I like the way that you got caught off guard, because this was nothing that you had prepared for. You were just a teacher, and that's not a bad thing. That's what you were doing.
Yeah, I was a totally ordinary teacher for the first 40-odd years of my life. Had no preparation for anything like this. I was a teacher, I was a mum, I was a wife, I was just an ordinary person. I had a variety of teaching jobs, but I fetched out working in this particular class, which was for children with statements of special educational needs, and they all had difficulty with speech or language, or in some cases both. And it was a fascinating job. I'd been doing it for 6 or 7 years, and my role, I thought, was to teach children who had difficulty either pronouncing different sounds because they had problems within their mouth, or using language or comprehension, all of the whole linguistic and language-based stuff. My job was to teach them to learn to speak properly and join in conversations and be able to go back to a mainstream school where they could learn properly. And that's really what I believed I was doing until I met Asher. And Asher turned up in my class one day, just any other child with speech and language difficulties. He was 6 years old, as you said, and he, well, for want of a better phrase, headhunted me. He told me that we'd made an agreement, we'd made a deal, was his way of explaining it, and I was going to be his special helper. And I said, so when did we make this deal exactly? Because you've only just ended up in my class and I've never known you before. And he just looked at me as if I was an idiot and said, before I was born. I thought, okay, so this was going to be new, this was going to be different. So I believed him, which I suppose in retrospect is a bit weird, because most people would just look at a 6-year-old child, especially one with a whole raft of special needs, and just think, oh dear, they've got a vivid imagination. But there was something about this kid that just made me think, he's telling me the truth. He's not making this story up. He actually remembers making an agreement with me before we were born that we would work together. And it turned out he was absolutely right. I didn't have any memory of it, but I went with it. And very shortly after that, he started to demonstrate to me, he and the other children in the class, who all seemed to be in on the act, started to demonstrate to me that they had perfectly good communication skills. It's just that their communication wasn't using words, it was using telepathy. And I found that they could communicate with each other, that there was all this going on in the classroom that I and the other staff had been completely unaware of. Even when I grasped what was going on, I didn't want to share that with anybody else there because I was pretty certain I'd lose my job, to be frank. I wasn't at all sure that anybody was going to believe me, and has turned out since that an awful lot of people don't believe it. So I just watched them, and they realised that I was interested, that I grasped what they were doing, and gradually, I can only use the word attuned, they sort of tuned me to it. It was like they decided, and they were all aged 5 to 7, very little children, but they decided to let me in on the act, if you like. And gradually at first I started to pick things up from them. At first it was just little things like I'd be busy working with one child and then I could feel there was another kid behind me who was beaming at me through his mind that he wanted me to stop working with this other child and work with him because he couldn't do his sums. And so when I told him, without even turning round, to just wait a minute and go and sit down because I was busy and I'd come to him shortly, the rest of the children realised what was happening, and led by Asher, they decided that I was picking this up. And it got to the stage, after a few months, I suppose, that I was starting with a few of the children to actually hear their voices in my head. They wouldn't be speaking, but I could be anywhere in the school. And there was one particular little boy, I've called him Max in the book, and he had this uncanny way of just beaming his thoughts into my head if there was something important going on. I think there's one piece in A Mind Beyond Words where I've explained we were in a whole school assembly and I was right across the room from them, right across the school hall. And he realised that the child next to him was feeling very poorly and was probably about to be sick. I was doing something completely different, and suddenly I heard Max's voice in my head going, "Miss, Miss, Miss," which was his way of saying miss, miss, miss. And I looked around and he was nowhere to be seen, and I said to other people around me, "Can anyone see where Max is?" And we looked around the hall, hundreds of kids, you know. Eventually somebody spotted him right at the back of the hall, so I went rushing down to him and just said, "Yeah, what's the matter?" And then he turned to me with his little voice and said, "Do you feel poorly?" And sure enough, the kid next to him was a nasty shade of green, and so He took this kid outside and got somebody to look after him and made sure he was all right. And then I just came back into the hall and said to Max, "Well done, that was really good." He just looked at me and smiled and silently into my head said, "Well done you got it." So yeah, that's how the telepathy worked.
That's amazing. I mean, really, what you're describing is something that I think we assume takes some kind of training or some kind of aptitude, and all of a sudden you're being introduced to it from children who haven't been taught. They just do it.
Well, my theory is that children all have that at birth. I think they start their human adventure with this ability, because if you think of the close relationship between a mother and child, say that babies don't have any other way of communicating. It's often a mother or a primary carer who knows why a baby's upset or what a baby needs. It could be just intuition, but I think it is a sort of telepathy that they're able to beam that need to the caregiver. And a lot of children have it drummed out of them because there's so much emphasis put on teaching children to speak, teaching them language, because that's one of the things on the tick sheet, isn't it? You've got to learn so many words, and you've got to learn more words and then put the words together into sentences, and then you're a real human being. But there are children who don't develop that, don't develop it very quickly, or in some cases don't develop it at all. And I think those are the children, and sometimes later the people, adults, who still have this telepathic ability.
What I think is fascinating, too, there's another part where there was some bullying going on. You intervened and talked to the guys who were bullying. And I like the way that you introduced this challenge to them. Could you share that?
Yeah. There was, because our specialist unit was with a mainstream school, the kids in the mainstream school all thought the children in my class were a bunch of wackos because they all talk funny. They had these funny voices and they couldn't make proper sounds, and so they were absolute bully bait. There was one very needy little boy in the class who had, I always said it was like he had a flashing light over his head saying, "Bully me, bully me." He was just a born victim, and 3 of the oldest children in the school, the 11-year-olds, decided they'd beat him up one day, one lunchtime. And so little Max again, this time he actually physically came and found me. He knew this was really important, and he came rushing in. Meh. So I followed him outside and found these bullies, and the little boy was being looked after by some of the midday assistant staff, and I told these boys to report to my room the next day. And I wanted to help them to understand what it was about our kids that made it difficult for them to speak. I really wanted to get across to the mainstream children that the children in my class weren't stupid, they weren't idiots, they weren't some kind of wackos, they just had a different way of being to the rest of the school. So I sat these 3 11-year-olds down and I said, "Okay, I'd like you to each take off one of your shoes and one of your socks." And they just looked at me as if I was completely deranged and decided I was probably quite a dangerous lunatic, but they knew they'd done something wrong and they knew I was a teacher, so they didn't have a choice. So they took off their shoes and socks. And so I said, "Okay, now I'd like you to wiggle just your middle toe, please. Just not any of the others, just the middle toe on that foot." And one of them, to my amazement, could actually do it. I can't do it, but he could. And the other 2 couldn't. So they sat there, feet moving about, and so I sort of congratulated the one who could do it and said, "Oh, that's very good, well done, but your mates can't do this, why not?" He said, "Well, I don't know." So I said, "Well, are you thinking they're really stupid then? Do you think you might beat them up for being so dense that they can't move their middle toe when you can do it?" And he said, "No, of course not. Stupid. You know, it doesn't matter whether you can move your middle toe or not, does it? And I said, no, you're quite right. I turned around to the other two boys and I said, well, why can't you do it? You're not trying hard enough. And they said, no, we're trying, but we can't get the right muscles to move to just move that toe. The others want to move as well. So I said, okay, well, we'll put your shoes and socks on again. And they did, still thinking I was completely crazy. And I said, the thing is, what if it was the muscles in your mouth that you couldn't isolate properly so that you can move them right? And they looked at me and realised this did actually have a point, and it did have something to do with what they'd done the day before. And I said, yeah, if it was the muscles in your mouth, it would matter more, wouldn't it? I said, when we talk, we have to use muscles very, very precisely. We have to, if you try making a sound like th, or a sound like p, or a sound like g, just try it yourself. See the different bits of your mouth that move. And so I gave them a selection of sounds to make, and they tried all these different things and agreed that they did have to move all sorts of parts of their mouth. And I said, well, that's the problem that the children in my class have, just like the two of you who were unable to move your toes successfully. These children find it hard to move those muscles in their mouth successfully. But I said, they're learning. That's why they're in this special class. And as well as doing all their ordinary work, all their English and their math and their science and all the rest of it, they have to also every day do a load of practice to strengthen the muscles in their mouth in order to be able to speak intelligibly, to be able to talk like you. And I said, do you think that means they deserve to be bullied, beaten up? Do you think that means that they're stupid? And these kids just went, no, it doesn't really. No. And so they thought they got off lightly because I hadn't used any sanctions. I hadn't raised my voice to them. I hadn't given them any sort of punishment. And I thought that they'd probably learned quite a valuable lesson and they wouldn't go around bullying my kids anymore. And everybody was right, actually. And that all worked out.
See, that's, I think, something that's very important because it gave them insight into what might be a difference that they hadn't even thought about before. And so there was an education element to that. Instead of a punishment where don't do that, you're bad, blah, blah, blah. It's like, hey, consider this. And it was a win-win.
Yes, I felt so. And I felt it was a much more effective way of dealing with it. In the past, it had always just been, you know, if children did something wrong, they were punished. And it doesn't really help, in my opinion.
I remember there's a long time ago, I can't remember the last name of the guy is Brown, and that same kind of element, what he was saying was, you know, you can tell somebody, and he used a sports metaphor or sports illustration analogy. The guy was kicking the ball, and the coach can go out and say, you're kicking it wrong, stop doing that, quit it, this, you know, and everything he could do to tell the guy how many ways he was doing it wrong. What he could do that would be better was to go out and say, I need you to kick it to the left, point your toe here, and give it a spin, or you know, something that said, this is how I want you to do it, rather than stop doing that, you're doing it wrong. Show me or tell me the way that I can do it better. And then everybody, again, it's a win-win.
Yeah, that is so much more successful. Yeah. Yes, I wish more of the education establishment would actually understand that. It's a very important thing.
Well, it's still rare in business too, so hey. It's one of the things that the guys who are really good figure it out and go forward. I also want to talk to you. This is about Asher, because there's a crucial time in his life when he lost his mom that you also had developed some abilities at that point. You were able to reach him. And this is also, I think, extremely important when these abilities are brought to use. And I would like you to share what happened when he lost his mom, and then you made a unique connection, basically channeling. She went into coma, and he was extremely distraught, losing her and blaming himself and not being able to make that last connection. And so you helped him out. You helped him out.
I did. The helping didn't happen immediately after he lost his mum. It was a few years later, a couple of years later, when he was still blaming himself. The reason he was blaming himself, she died of cancer, bless her, and, it wasn't in any way his fault, obviously. But, children do tend to blame themselves for anything that goes wrong in their lives. If their parents split up, they think it's their own fault. If something bad happens, they think they must have done something wrong, because kids are told off a lot, and so kids tend to think, oh, I must be naughty, I must be bad, I must have done something wrong. For whatever reason, Asher blamed himself. He was only a very little boy. He was only 8 or 9 when she was dying, and they knew she had only a few months to live. It was terminal. And during that time, he tried his best to ignore her, which in retrospect wasn't a very good way of dealing with it. But remember, he was an autistic child. He was very small. He was frightened. He was terrified. And in his little way, he thought, well, if I can just lock Mum out of my life, then when she dies, it won't seem quite so bad. And so he'd walk through a room that she was in, and she'd say, hi, how was school today, or whatever, and he'd just walk past her and ignore her. And this carried on for quite a long time. And when she went into the hospice towards the very end of her life, he would always find an excuse why he didn't want to go and visit her. He just wanted to stay away. And it wasn't that he didn't love his mother. He absolutely adored her. He loved her to bits. She was the most wonderful lady, and he had a wonderful relationship with her. But he was trying to prepare himself for this thing that he couldn't even imagine. I mean, no child can imagine life without their parent. And when you're autistic as well, it just exacerbated things for him. So towards the very end of her life, he still hadn't been to see her. And on my last visit to her at the hospice, she said to me, look, could you try and get him to come and say goodbye to me before I go? Because she said, I don't think I've got many days left, and if he doesn't, he's really going to give himself a hard time for it afterwards. And so I promised I would, and the next day I went to school and I said, look, I went to see your mummy last night, and she's really, really insistent that you go and see her, because she says she hasn't got very long left, and she does want a chance for you to say goodbye to her. And so he said, yeah, okay, I will. I'll go and see her. And so when his dad came and collected him from school, he said, well, I'll go and see Mum tonight. And that was just a day after I'd seen her. But by the time he got there, she had sunk into a coma. And, well, as medical science would have it, she was unconscious and she was unresponsive. And he went and sat in the room with her and talked to her and told her he loved her and all the rest of it. But there was no response from her, so he assumed that she hadn't heard him, that she didn't know, and when she died a day or two later, that she hadn't realised that he did love her, and she might have died not thinking that. So that was the background to it. That was how he felt. Oh, it's a very long story, really, but there was a few years later, when he was sort of just into his teens, he was really finding life difficult. He was very, very upset and quite a disturbed little boy, and was also getting in with some quite difficult kids at his secondary school, and there were problems. And I found that his mother found a way of contacting me, and this wasn't down to me, this was entirely down to her. She passed on, but she was making contact with me in quite an unusual way. I do explain it in A Mind of My Own Words. And I found that I could pick up messages from her. Once I grasped that I could actually get information, initially it was things like watch him, watch that group of children he's with, they're not good for him. There's some bad stuff going on. You need to move him away from that. And so I dealt with that, and I had explained to Asher that I was getting communication from his mum, and he was really excited at first. He was, so she's still around. That's great. That's fantastic. And then somebody I told about it said, well, don't you see what you can do now? You can get his mother to tell you what was said at their last meeting when she was unresponsive, because she knows exactly what happened. And if she can tell you and you write it down, you can give that to him, and that's proof to him that she did hear him. She did hear him say, I love you, Mum. And so I went home and I made contact with her, and she dictated, it's the only way I can describe it, she dictated everything that happened at that meeting, even down to the tiniest details. And I wrote it all down, and I typed it up neatly, and then I got rid of my draft copy because I didn't want to keep that because I felt it was a very private conversation. I put it into an envelope, and I called Asher up and I said, look, I've got something rather special to give you. And so I said, okay, we'll meet up at the weekend. And so we did, and I handed him this envelope, and he opened it up and was able to read everything that had happened in that final session that he'd spent with his mother. And yeah, I don't think I have had a more powerful moment than seeing his face after he'd read that. And he had to leave me at that point and say, I just need to be on my own for a while, and I absolutely respected and understood that. And so, yeah, I was able to show him that even though she was supposed to be unresponsive, she was taking in every word, understanding every word, and she was able to give it to me even after she'd passed over.
Well, the thing about that is, as you continue through the book, his other abilities going into different dimensions and different senses of awareness, the one that might help elucidate that is his ability. He didn't read books the way, most people go get a book and read it. And you were doing a lot of reading and research. He had a really cool ability. This is one that would blow your mind, and would be very convenient if we could all do it.
Oh, I wish.
Yeah.
Oh, you think of the years we would save. He was a very good reader. He was capable of reading. He was a very bright kid, but I could never persuade him to read books for pleasure. He never, ever chose to read. And one time I was talking to him about one of these very complicated esoteric books I'd been reading, because I was reading like crazy to try and keep up with him. He kept on telling me all these amazing downloads he was getting from some multidimensional source, and I was reading everything I could to try and keep abreast of what he was talking about. And I'd found this one book that I just could not understand. It was absolutely beyond my comprehension level. And he was in his early teens then, I suppose, and I was trying to explain what I'd read in this book to him, and I was rubbish. I could not do it. He looked at me and said, have you got it with you? And I said, yeah. Hold it out flat on the palm of your hand. So I got it out of my bag. I held this book out. I can't remember the title of the book, but it was quite complicated stuff. And held it out on the palm of my hand. And he just took his own hand and laid it very gently on top of the book for a couple of minutes, probably less than that, and smiled, and then took his hand away, and then he just very calmly gave me a very detailed précis of the bit that I'd already read and the bit that I hadn't even got to, and just summed up the book in, I don't know, within 5 minutes.
See, this is completely beyond the pale. And I've heard stories of this before, that's something that can be done. But here's someone who is autistic. He's in a league of his own, because it's very difficult for us to understand how autism works because it's unique. It isn't, they aren't all the same. That's the problem. It's somebody's autistic. Well, that doesn't mean we have a label, but it doesn't apply like cookie cutter, one size fits all.
No, there's that very appropriate saying, isn't there? Once you've met one autistic person, you've met one autistic person.
Yeah.
That absolutely sums it up, because I have met dozens, because wherever I ended up teaching, I met lots of people who were neurodivergent and had different ways of being, and they always seemed to fetch up in my classes wherever I went, which was wonderful, because I just love working with these people. And they were all different, and certainly not all of them had these psychic gifts and these abilities and the talents that Asher had, not by any means. Some of them were quite psychic, some of them were telepathic, and some of them had other gifts. Some of them were amazing at maths, or fantastic with patterns, or incredible with art, or whatever. But there was always a difference. There was always something exciting.
Jes Kerzen, author of A Mind Beyond Words. A quick break. A Mind Beyond Words. It's about a telepathic connection between Jes Kerzen and Asher. Jes was Asher's teacher. They met when he was 6 years old. Since then, he's now in his 30s, they have developed an incredible connection, and they are trying to help others understand how this telepathic connection works. He had a lot of other abilities, and some of that scared him.
It did.
The other part was the psychic ability, that the premonitions that came with that. So, in a way, I guess what I'm trying to say is it isn't always good to know about other people and about other things that are going on. Sometimes it's you would prefer not to know because it isn't always pleasant. Now, does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes absolute sense. And I think in his teens, while these abilities were still developing, it really scared the living daylights out of him sometimes. We'd just be somewhere and he'd suddenly say he'd seen a vision of what the world was going to be like, and he'd seen some horrible cataclysm, and he didn't want to talk about it, he didn't want to describe it, but just looking at his face, he was not making this up. He was really seeing something that he didn't like at all. And I said, well, how can it be set in tablets of stone? The future, surely it's an open book. We don't know what's going to happen in the future. And he just said, well, I can see all these different paths, and there's lots of different ways the future could go, but they all seem to lead to this point, and I can't see a way around it. So yeah, it did scare him. And the other thing that gave him a problem was when he was 16, he got the official diagnosis of Asperger's syndrome. Up until then, nobody had really bothered to give that kind of diagnosis, but I don't know whether it was the school or his family or somebody asked for him to be checked out, and some experts said, oh yes, you've got Asperger's syndrome, and told him all the things that were wrong with him, which is just what an introverted 16-year-old does not need to hear. So it was all you find getting along with other people difficult, and you find it hard to make friends, and you'll find it difficult to do this and do that, and you need your routines, and you probably have panic attacks, do you? And everything negative that this doctor could possibly think of to do with Asperger's, he was, laying it all on with a spade. And then he said to Asher, have you had any other symptoms, anything else that makes you different from other people, from ordinary people? And I wasn't there, I'll hasten to add, but this is what Ash told me afterwards. And being a very honest young lad, he said, well, yeah, sometimes I see things or hear things that other people can't see or hear, and I never know quite what to do about that. And so this doctor said, well, yeah, a lot of people with Asperger's have that. It's called hallucination. You just have to ignore them, and you don't take any notice of them, and just tell yourself it's a load of rubbish and you've just made it all up, and your brain's playing tricks. And so, no, don't worry about that at all. Just ignore it all. And so just in that one day, this doctor knocked the ground from under him. And afterwards he said to me, well, I was delusional. That's what it was. I was delusional. So it was all rubbish. So don't believe any of those things I told you. And if you do believe them, then you must be delusional because they weren't true. And I said, no, I've been watching you very carefully since you were 6 years old, and I know you have these very uncanny abilities, and it's not a delusion, and it's not hallucinations. And I was just this lone voice, and back in those days, you'd go on the internet, and every article was about what a pathology it was, and how bad it was, and it was an illness and a disease, and it was a disorder, and he was just convinced that he just had to suppress the whole thing, and it took him months, and it took me months and months of trying to persuade him otherwise. So, yeah, that wasn't helpful.
At that time of your life, you're trying to fit in. You're trying to be part of the group. You're trying to be normal. The word there, the description, when he said, what else makes you different? What makes you stand out from the crowd? And he's like, anything that makes me that different isn't helpful. And so he immediately identified with anything that made him, I think, special. And that's exactly what he was trying to avoid. And he'd already been accustomed to being special, having been put in a different class from the beginning. It's just, it's sad that had to go the indirect route of him being able to reassess and reclaim his own abilities.
Yeah, it was a very, very difficult time. And yes, you're 100% right. He did at that age, certainly. Every teenage kid wants to fit in. They've got to wear the same style of trainers, and they've got to like the same band, and they've got to like the same football team and whatever, haven't they? It's just, you want to be part of the gang, and he really found that hard because he didn't instinctively feel like the rest of them, but he wanted to blend in. He wanted to have mates. He wanted to be one of the crowd. So, yeah, I mean, he'd never talked to his schoolmates about these things that happened. I was the only person he did talk to about that, but he wouldn't even talk to me about them after that. It was just suppressing the whole thing for months and months and months.
And the book, you describe some certain events, ways of getting together and going on a journey. And you didn't always like the way that the journeys were orchestrated. Okay.
No, it used to drive me crazy.
Yeah. Because technically you want to go from point A to point B. But he was A, and then there was D, G, O, R, Q, S. Then eventually you might get to the other. And so he explained, you finally said, what is this about?
Yeah. Yes, I don't drive, and I used to take him out at weekends. It started off as, when his mother was ill, it started off as me doing respite care to take him out so that the parents had a bit of time together, or, just to sort out all the things they had to sort out. And after that, I agreed to carry on, and his dad was really grateful that he was being taken off his hands for a day. And because I couldn't drive, I said, well, we've got a really good train service that goes to London or whatever, so I'll take you out for a train ride. So he became obsessed with trains, very typically autistic trait. He loved the train rides, and the underground system in London, the tube system, became his absolute dream place to be. He loved travelling around on the underground, and we've got quite an extensive system with lots of different lines, and I gave him a tube map, and I said, okay, you plan our routes, you plan where we're going for the day. And I sensed, I think, that he needed to have some control of something, because he didn't have much control of anything in his life, and he said he'd really lost a lot of confidence after his mum had died. And so we had this game, really, where I would buy an all-day ticket that just covered every line there was, every route there was, right through the whole city. And he would plan these journeys. And they used to drive me crazy. I mean, travelling on the underground is never a really pleasant experience in my view. But, he'd say, okay, we've got to get off here, and then we're changing lines, and then we're going in that direction. He'd never tell me where we were going. It was always his little secret. Right, off here and on to somewhere else. So we'd carry on. And we'd go on like this for ages, and round about lunchtime he'd say, okay, you've got half an hour to grab some lunch, and then we need to get back onto the trains. And there was one day I just lost it. I said, look, for goodness sake, it's a beautiful sunny day, it's lovely up here, can't we just stay in this beautiful place for an hour or so? No, because we've got to get back to the terminus, and we're never going to make the journey if we stop off here for too long. It's too complicated. And I said, well, why do you plan our trips like this? So there's so much riding around, and we never actually get anywhere or do anything. We just go in all these different directions, stop for lunch for half an hour, and then do the same thing going back again. It's exhausting, and it's smelly, and it's underground, and it's just not fun. And he just stopped and looked at me and said, it's not the destination that matters. It's not where we're going. It's the journey. And I said, how do you mean? And he said, well, that's what it's all about, isn't it? And I said, you're not just talking about tube rides, are you? And he said, no. Sort of an analogy for life, if you like. Just explaining that we're not here to get from A to B. We're here to go on this convoluted, weird, crazy journey that takes us all over the place. But it's getting round, and the more complicated it is, in his case, the better he liked it. And,
Everything. Okay. So, and on one of these trips, he actually gives you a life lesson in terms of trying to tell you how the universe works. And this is brilliant. I don't know that anybody can do it as easy as he can, but it is a very unique way of presenting it.
Yeah, he always has had, and still does, in fact, very unique ways of teaching things. So, he told me on that particular day that I think he was about 15 at the time. Can't remember now, something like that. He was in his teens. He told me during the week that he had a map of all the atoms in the universe.
That's impressive. Okay.
Well, I was even either impressive or incredibly big-headed. I couldn't decide which really. I said, how do you mean? And he said, well, I don't know if you'd call it atoms. He said it doesn't really, I don't know what the right word is, but, I've got this map of how it all works. And he said, I'll give you a copy if you want. And so I said, I'd really like a copy of that.
Yeah.
So you would, wouldn't you? So we got onto the train, because we planned another train ride the next time, and he handed me a sheet of paper, an ordinary sheet of printer paper, and on it were little circles, very small circles, about, half an inch diameter, and they were all lined up in rows and columns, all touching each other, not overlapping, but just against the next. And so the whole of the sheet of paper, as far as it stretched, was just lots and lots of little circles. And I looked at him and I said, this is some sort of joke. And he was really hurt. No, that's the best way I could find to show it to you. And at that stage in his life, he wasn't really capable of explaining it any further, and he found it quite difficult. Much later, and I have sort of put it in further into A Mind Beyond Words, he said, he explained it to me telepathically, and he said you could take it at any level, from atoms, from subatomic particles, right up to human beings to galaxies, and he said that everything is interconnected. It's all got a structure. Take one of those things out and it collapses. It doesn't work right. But none of them can work without the rest of the system, without all the ones that are around it. I thought that was a pretty cool way for a young lad to try and explain all of that. So, yeah, that was his map of all the atoms in the universe.
But then he also showed you and said, here, this is a challenge. Get this water bottle from point A to point B, and you know, to do this. And he knew how to do it. And okay.
Okay, I'll tell that story.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah, so yes, he'd been thinking about how to explain to me, and as I say, he hadn't at that stage in his life got the language to put it across to me in words. We're sitting opposite each other on a train in one of those seats that has a table in between, and he'd got a plastic bottle of water which was on his side of the table, and he said to me, well, all right, let's see if you can work it out this way. How could you get this bottle of water from here to your side of the table over there? And I looked at this bottle of water and I said, well, it's still full, so it's too heavy for anyone to blow it. And I said, the table is bolted down to the carriage floor, so I can't shunt the table about. And I said, that's not the sort of thing you mean, is it? He said, no, that's not the sort of thing I mean. So I said, well, you've just been talking about all these atoms and molecules and things. Do you mean I need to somehow move the molecules from in front of it to behind it and, you know, move it in that way? And he just raised his eyes and said, that is such a long way round. He didn't say you can't do it that way. He just said that's a really long way round. He said, just see it where you want it to be. So this was a long time ago. This was before manifestation became a big thing, and everybody was doing workshops on how to manifest, you know, abundance and all the rest of it.
Yeah.
This was just a little boy or a teenage boy sitting on a train saying, see it where you want it to be. So I sat there and focused on this bottle of water, and he was smiling and focusing on the bottle of water, and I didn't have a lot of hope for it doing anything because bottles of water don't tend to migrate across tables, do they? And then the guard came into our carriage. I don't know if you have the same in the States, but they come in and they check your tickets and clip it and move on to the next person. And this guard came into our carriage, came up to me, asked for my ticket, checked it, went to him, asked for his ticket and checked it, and that must have taken seconds, no longer than that. And during that tiny encounter, for no reason that I could possibly imagine, it's not like it was in the way or anything, the guard just picked up the bottle of water and moved it and put it in front of me. And then he walked on through. And Asher just sat there and smiled.
Ta-da! Well, and so, then that is what it's like. Oh, there's other people that might be able to accomplish this mission. That didn't even factor in.
No. And when much later on, when he was able to discuss this with me as an adult, because we've been back over these things, and that was one of the things in our life I'd never been able to get my head around properly.
Yeah.
And I said to him, just why? How did that happen? You know, what did you influence that man? Did you use your sort of amazing brain to sort of make him do it? And he said, well, you know, you just take any opportunity that comes. It might have been somebody walking through the carriage and jolting the table, or it might have been that guard moving it, or it might have been a window open and it blew. He said, the how doesn't matter. All you have to do is sort out what it is you want to happen, focus on it as if it's already happened, and leave, I love this phrase, leave life to join up the dots.
See, I think that's amazing. And the other thing, and I'm going to, in the book, the words, it's more important than imagining. Imagination is powerful in a general sense, but this is intention. You control your world. It doesn't exist outside of your perception. That's what Asher's saying. That is amazing and so important because it puts it makes it concise. And then you see what he might be able to accomplish with that kind of knowledge.
Yeah, and if the rest of us had that kind of knowledge, what we could accomplish.
Yes. Yeah. So, and then beyond that, as you continue through the book, getting into his world and the fact that, a lot of times he isn't really here because he's out exploring.
Yeah. Yes, as an adult, he's more or less divided himself into two personas, if you like. It's, I don't think it's some scientists or doctors or whatever would say it's a sort of pathology, but I don't think it is at all. He's decided that he can get on with his day-to-day life. He's a young man now in his 30s, and he can get up and go to work and come back from work and manage in his fairly repetitive, quiet way, but he's got this completely other life where he moves out of body. He goes off to discover all these amazing things, and whereas as a teenager it all happened in a rather haphazard way so that he wasn't really in control and didn't know when things were going to happen, what he's mastered now as a grown man is that he can choose when he moves out to the realms, as he calls them, these other place. And, I mustn't call it a place. He says it's not a place because there's no space and there's no time in other dimensions, but you know what I mean.
Yeah.
So he's, he has complete control over what he does, and he moves out of body, and it's from these realms of his that he sends me back the telepathic information that is in the final part of A Mind Beyond Words, that I've more or less handed over the final part of the book to him and said, okay, you've got all this information, share it, let's have it. And then I have to write down all the stuff that he sends to me telepathically.
This is what I think is amazing. The two of you have this dynamic that is so unique, and the areas that he's exploring beyond the physical into the other dimensions, and even going back into past lives, Atlantis, and saying how the two of you had worked together before, and using telepathy, helping young children access those abilities. There's so much more. I think I'm hoping you guys have another book. At least another book, maybe more. But he
has hinted at this, yes.
I mean,
yeah,
because it's a mountain out there that he's of the non-physical that he is actually climbing, and I'm really, I would love to see what he is getting into now.
Yeah, well, I'm writing a little about it on Medium, but he's hinting that maybe there's another book in the offing. I just want to get the publication of this one out the way first, and then we'll get going on that.
Yeah. One foot in front of the other. Okay, yeah, I know. He's not good at ABCD. He likes to go AQR elephant dog.
You've got it. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, well, that's the thing. It happens so fast and all at once that I can imagine how difficult it would be to slow it down and make it linear, because he has all this stuff coming at him at once, and it's just so fascinating and so interesting that it would be hard to stop it and say, okay, I just need to go slower. Like, why? Why? That's what's exciting about it.
Yes, and that's the challenge, really. When I do get these downloads from him, I have gradually taught him. I think the first session we ever did, our first proper session, he said to me, "Why are you going so slow?" And I said, "Because I am writing down what I'm getting from you."
Yeah.
And he said, "Oh, why?" And I said, "Because I would remember about an eighth of it if I didn't, if that." I said, "I need to write down all our conversations." So I think there's 12 notebooks sitting upstairs next to my bed, which are all absolutely crammed with our conversations, where I just write down my questions or my responses and then do my best to put into words what he sent to me, because it doesn't always come in words. Sometimes it does, and sometimes it comes in pictures, and sometimes it comes in mind movies, and sometimes it comes in feelings like I'm being moved about, or temperature changes, or it can be all sorts of things. It's very, very multisensory, and I just have to try and squeeze it into words. So that's my challenge.
Well, there's so many levels that he's working on. At one point, you guys are working with remote viewing, trying to see, you're going on a trip and he's describing where you're at. And at one point you're saying, well, it really didn't match up with what I was experiencing, that the visual was different. And then when you went back to compare it, well, it would make sense without a body that he would be picking up on, the light in the room, or, the textures that he was experiencing. I think that's where people are frustrated when they do an out-of-body experience and all of a sudden they don't get the literal linear view of our world. Okay, I'm not seeing the people here, but I'm seeing shapes and images and forms, and that's still being out of body. It just is a different dimension, which we aren't always prepared to experience. It's like, oh, wow. Yeah, it was real, but it was on another plane.
Yeah, and don't you think that's like when we, as in our human state, some people will see ghosts, for want of a better word, and it won't be somebody who looks as solid and normal as the person standing next to you, but you'll get an impression of, and it could be quite hazy, and it could be, and he got exactly the same when he did the remote viewing with me. He'd be somewhere different and he'd see the place I was in, but he wouldn't see me there. He'd just see things, and he wouldn't see them through my eyes. He'd see them from a few yards away from where I was standing or sitting.
At this point, what do you think is the most important part about the dynamic that you two are trying to present?
The most important part, I think that the physical body is limited, but the mind and the spirit are completely limitless. And I think it's to be open, to be curious, and to refuse to accept the limitations that our culture, our society, and our experts have tried to impose on us. Because if you can get out of that, sort of societal idea, particularly there's nothing but the human body, and when you die, that's the end of it, and you just turn to dust. Obviously, there is a great deal more, and Asher is living proof of that. And the fact that he's still physical, he's in a body. When I'm picking this stuff up from him, it's almost like channeling, but I'm not channeling some disembodied spirit guide. I'm channeling a guy who lives in London, and I've known most of his life. So these things are possible, and as I'm going out into society, I'm finding people who, as I talk about the book, as I talk about the Mind Beyond Words, they say, "Oh, yeah, I've experienced something like that," or I've been with people and I felt that feeling, and they feel it's all right to talk about it finally.
There's something that you refer to as an astral envelope, and I think that's a unique way of putting it. Can you explain, because there's 2 or 3 times that's a repeating reference, the astral envelope.
Yeah, the astral envelope is what I was just talking about, really. It's our phrase for the way he puts things across to me. He doesn't just put words into my head. He puts images, he puts mind movies, it's like filling an envelope up with all the different senses. If you just imagine an envelope stuffed with, I don't know, rose petals, so you've got the smell of them, and you've got the texture of this, and you've got something else, and you fill this envelope up until it's got a multi-sensory pile of thoughts and memories that help somebody to understand what you're experiencing, then that's what an astral envelope is, and that's how he puts his material across to me.
There is so much in this book. It's really hard to cover it in a short amount of time. It's dense with material. It's with ideas, with potentials, with all sorts of, I think if you're into ESP or telepathy or consciousness exploration, then there are so many places you can jump off and explore that he's offering because he's done it. And he's trying to give a language with your help for others to follow the pattern or follow the wave or follow the lead. And that's what I love about this material is that when he was a kid, 6 years old, he had already pegged you as, all right, you're mine. Okay, now we got to get together. And you're like, yeah. Okay. This is amazing because now you're talking he's in his 30s and you've had years, decades to home in on what the process is and how you can possibly bring a language to it and help others understand basically this path, this leaving breadcrumbs for people and hopefully maybe stepping stones and possibly a rope or a ladder that brings this to fruition, because what you've done is really laid the groundwork for a very unique course of learning how to connect with people who may not be verbal but are incredibly active in their mind.
Yeah, yes, I think if there's one thing that comes out of it, again and again, the people who come to me and say, yeah, this makes sense, are often people who work with non-speaking adults in, specialist institutions or care homes or whatever, or people who work in specialist environments for small children with additional needs, or children who haven't learned to speak yet, or people with Down syndrome, people with all sorts of conditions which our society sees as flaws or faults. But actually these people, I always say it's a bit like a monk going halfway up a mountain and sitting in some retreat and not having all that verbal contact and having all of that stuff going on, and can just focus on the spiritual, can just focus on what they want to really learn and what they can discover if they haven't got all the day-to-day distractions that fill up our lives.
A lot of this material is also illustrated as part of a shamanic experience, encounter, path. And what I just interviewed somebody about the problems they have with coma, and knowing that this, after doing a lot of research with people who've been in coma as a result of COVID, knowing that they don't put you to sleep. It isn't, you aren't asleep when you are in a coma. You are basically in a different realm, on a different level. And if someone who is telepathic or aware of their ability to go into an OBE state and possibly connect with somebody else, they might be able to retrieve someone who's stuck on a level in the coma that they are not able to free themselves from. So that's where I see this going, is this developing these other abilities to interact and intersect with people who are not in the physical, with other, and I will say intelligences, that are still very real and very present and very active, but we don't get there until we start learning our own abilities with the telepathy and the other insight that comes from knowing that the spirit is active. It doesn't have to have a physical body. And when they're active, then you can connect. That's what I believe can go forward from your work.
I think that's a wonderful thought. Yeah. Wouldn't that be incredible?
So, okay, I guess we'll wrap for now and tell Asher, yes, book 2, workbook, whatever he wants to do. Oh, please, yes, yeah, don't stop.
Yes, I'll pass that message on.
Okay, yeah. And in the meantime, though, the book is available on Amazon, and you have a website for people who would like to connect with you. What's the best way?
Yeah, my website's a very good place to start. It's www.ashertree, which is ASHERTREE.com. And I've got a contact page on there. I've got a newsletter that comes out once a month, which people can subscribe to. I've written on there that any future books will be noted on there. So, yes, it's just a way for me to keep people in touch with what we're up to and what we're doing.
I know it's been a long slog, because there were sometimes when you talk about this that people weren't all on board with what the two of you were discovering and exploring, and especially when you're talking about the guy who said it's all delusional. Like, darn, let's get beyond that. And maybe this will give people a way to understand there is something beyond that. It isn't a delusion. It is just another way of accessing consciousness and awareness, and we need to learn more about it.
We certainly do, Wendy, yes. Thank you. And thank you for being so on board with all that we've said, because it's just wonderful to hear people who can understand this and can accept it. It's great. Thank you very much.
Absolutely. I'll put links in the description for the show. Jes Kerzen, A Mind Beyond Words, available at Amazon, and check out her YouTube site. Thanks for listening.